So Dr. Grace Xiao will serve as a moderator for faculty research presentation. Grace?
Okay, should we start?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we're all just in here, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then, yeah, Dr. Dean Freer here.
So good afternoon. Welcome back to the Sidhu Virtual Research and Teaching Symposium, Session 2, Faculty Presentations. As you know, I'm Dr. Grace Xiao, and will be your moderator for this session. So in this session, we will have 3 presentations presented by a group of Sidhu School faculty on some timely subjects and ranging from health outcomes to accounting risk management and to the future of trading in the private equity. But before we get started, I want to take a moment to remind you that each presentation is about 15 minutes long, and it followed by a 5-minute Q&A session. So now move along to our first presentation by Dr. Justin Matus. He will be speaking to us on a comparison of countries' cultural dimensions and health outcomes. Please welcome.
Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for everyone coordinating this. So the title, as you can see, is a comparison of looking at different countries. And I always tell my students, even for the best presenters, 1 slide per minute is hard to do. I have 16 slides, so I'm shooting for 15 minutes. And of course, I know this from Zoom, like the little sidebar gets in the way of my slides. So first slide just depicts healthcare spending by a variety of countries. And you'll notice USA #1 in spending. And this particular measure is per capita healthcare spending. Another way to kind of look at it, and an often cited metric, if you will, is percent of GDP health spending. They're kind of 2 sides of the same coin. Ultimately, in the analysis, I used per capita spending as the independent variable. The other independent variable that we're going to look at is life expectancy, and I'll talk about both of those in a second. So let me get to the life expectancy tables, and here's USA. So if you're wondering, well, what's the research question? Well, there it is. How is it that the greatest country in the world can spend all that money and yet have, relatively speaking, a fairly poor outcome? Why is that? Why don't we get the bang for the buck? Now, certainly, I'm not the first person to come along and notice this or try and answer the question. And I'll let you read this quote here, and I'll talk over it if you don't mind. A lot of the country comparisons have looked at other things and have been able to explain some of those differences. For example, the diet, right? We've all heard of the Mediterranean diet. There's a little village in Italy that's well known, well documented, that these people live forever. And it's like, well, is it the olive oil? They have no stress. They walk every day. But a variety of these studies, they invariably say, well, we can't explain everything, so it must be culture. So it's kind of like the spaghetti sauce. It's all in there. But what specifically about culture is causing this phenomenon or these differences? Now, the other thing that's interesting is there's a variety of definitions of culture, and culture. There's been researchers who've tried to use culture as a measure of health behavior, for example. So is there any difference between various ethnic groups and, say, the likelihood that they would have unprotected sex? But that's kind of a narrow approach, if you will, and not to discount it at all. But this research hopefully is a little more encompassing and really the idea that culture is explaining a lot. It is a big chunk. I'll say I want to suggest uh, that culture is a big chunk of what's happening in this phenomenon, if you will. Countries like us spend a lot of money, but have such a poor outcome, or relatively speaking, a less desirable outcome with our lower life expectancy. So I'm using a particular measure, if you will, of culture. It's a Dutch researcher by the name of Hofstede. Uh, I would say he's well known, or if you've maybe taken a course in organizational behavior, you may have heard of him. And it's interesting. He actually, he freely admits he stumbled into this, but he really struck gold when in the early 80s, I believe it was, he got access to surveys from about 360,000 IBM employees. And for those younger folks in the audience, IBM back in its heyday was Apple, Google, all wrapped into one, and a really powerful company. And they were worldwide. So he was able to kind of play around with this data, and it represented many, many countries. And he came up with this notion that there's these dimensions of culture. And originally he only had 4. He since added a 5th and a 6th. And it's not like they're added every week. So over the span of about 40 years, this is where he's landed on these 6 dimensions. Let me see if I can explain them or define them briefly, and then we'll put up a graph that I think will really illustrate. I think you'll like these graphs. So power distance, his words here: social inequality, including the relationship with authority. This really has to do with your, I won't say willingness, but your acceptance of how much power resides at the top or doesn't reside at the top. Individualism versus collectivism, democracy, socialism, everything in between. Masculinity, femininity, that's been, I don't want to say evolved into more politically correct language, but the definition is, I think, more contemporary. And that is to say, in a particular country, in that culture, does it matter if you're born male or female? And and all these concepts are measured on a scale of 1 to 100. Okay, the last 3: uncertainty, avoidance, pretty straightforward definition. What about uncertainty? Does it bother us? Are we accepting of it? Or somewhere in between? And then these last 2 are the more recent ones: long-term versus short-term orientation. I think that's self-evident. And then indulgence versus restraint. So let's go ahead and put up some data, if you will, some graphs. And so reading from left to right, you'll see the USA. And I selected a lot of these countries, but I'll focus on the first 3. The USA to the left, Russia, the second one from the left, and third from the left is my old favorite country, Denmark, and then Singapore and Italy. So just by way of reference, those are the 5 countries we're looking at from left to right. And along the bottom here, you can see the 6 dimensions of culture. So I've highlighted the USA. So let's start with PDI and where the US is versus Russia, and finally Denmark. So we can see that Russia has the highest, Denmark has the lowest, and the USA is in the middle. So what does it mean? Well, in Russia, I would say they're kind of the population, the culture is such that we don't have a lot of power. The power is very far away from us, power distance. In the USA, we say, oh, well, the power is somewhat, down in Harrisburg or Washington, D.C., whereas in Denmark, they're basically saying, no, there's no more power in Copenhagen than there is in my little village in Jutland. If you're familiar with Singapore, I think you might understand why they score a little higher. Let's move to the next one, individual versus collective. The US scores very high on our individualism. And you think about the history of our country and how it was founded, 40 acres and a mule. We expanded westward. There was, I'll say, at least historically, a notion of every man for him or herself and no limit to what you might achieve. Russia, on the other hand, geared more towards the collective. And Denmark, with things like high tax rates and socialized medicine, no surprise there that the culture favors the collective. Masculine, feminine, USA high on masculines, a greater advantage, as we saw with our student research. In certain instances, in a lot of instances, it's better to be a man than a woman in the USA. Sorry, ladies. Whereas in Denmark, almost no difference, or at least comparatively speaking, really doesn't matter if you're male or female. And I found that very much to be true in all my experiences in Denmark. There was really just in every setting, it just didn't come into play. Fourth one, uncertainty avoidance. Again, Russia very high, Denmark fairly low, and the US kind of in the middle. Last two, long-term orientation. If you have compared corporate behavior in the US versus, say, corporate behavior in countries like Japan, that's one of the criticisms of corporate America is we're too focused on quarterly earnings at the expense of long-term benefits. And I'll leave interpretations to you about what it means for Russia and these other countries in terms of long-term orientation. And then the last one is very intuitive, I think, indulgence versus restraint. A lot of restraint in the Soviet Union, whereas here in the US and countries like Denmark, we're not afraid to treat ourselves. Any questions so far? Okay. All right, so my two basic research questions, do the dimensions, these 6 dimensions of culture, those are my independent variables, predict life expectancy, and do those dimensions of culture predict healthcare spending? And let me explain briefly why I chose life expectancy and healthcare spending. We could spend a whole afternoon talking about the definition of health, what's the meaning of health. So I try to make it very simple and intuitive. If you think about health, there's an input, right? Spending. And there's an output, an ultimate output, how long you live. So try to keep it nice and tidy, neat, and able to get our hands around it. So the first model did a simple regression with an R-square of 0.45. And these 3 variables loaded significantly, including individual versus collective, long-term orientation, and indulgence. Power distance, masculinity, and uncertainty avoidance did not enter into the equation. Now, in terms of interpreting what does it mean, there's if you look at the beta, the column 0.374 for individuality, long-term orientation 0.413, and individuality 0.320. The stronger those measures, the longer the life expectancy. So at some level, we're saying that individualism might help you live longer. Now, it doesn't speak well for your neighbor, does it? But it is perhaps something for us to look at further and think about. Okay, the second model simply used per capita healthcare spending. One more. And this time, and we had a higher R-square, 0.63. The same 3 entered in the equation, individuality, long-term orientation, and indulgence. But look at the top, power distance entered the equation. And in this, the negative beta is saying, look, the higher the power distance, the less we'll spend. And one of the things I write about in the paper is that this may suggest, and think about this, if you have a high power distance, all the power is in the Kremlin, you have low expectations and they're met. Whereas in a country like Denmark, where they feel that the power is very much in their own individual hands at the local level, they'll spend more money. And likewise in the US, as you might recall, or I'll even go back to the power distance slide real quick. I'll try to, where we had the PDI, power distance for the US. I'm suggesting that we spend a fair amount of money because we expect a fair amount of money to be spent, but it speaks nothing to the efficiency of that spending. So the million dollar questions is what does it all mean? And I should mention, I think I have some no, I don't. In the paper, I spent a lot of time, obviously, talking about some of the weaknesses of the study, and there are many. But kind of discussion questions. So does it mean we should spend more wisely? Well, my take on this is, if you look at the U.S. Historically, and even up until today, I think the appeal for healthcare for all has been an emotional appeal or an ethical or moral argument, as opposed to an economic appeal. And what I would like to suggest is the findings might be the opportunity where we stop trying to shame and guilt people into a different model for healthcare, but make the argument that it's more cost effective, that in the end, you can get all the things you want in healthcare, have a good outcome, have a better outcome for less money. So that's my pitch. I'll stop sharing here, and if we have time, I'll take questions. I don't know how I did on time, 1:17. So. No questions. Maybe that's a good thing. Yeah, Wujan. Yeah.
Kadir also has a question.
Oh, okay, Kadir. Yeah, thank you.
Kadir, you can go ahead first, and then I'm gonna go next.
Okay, thanks so much for this interesting presentation. It's always nice to look at two different variables and explore the relationship. I have two questions. So some people argue that one of the reasons why healthcare is very expensive in the United States, obviously very expensive. That's why we have the highest spending compared to other countries.
Yeah.
Is there any relationship between greed and individualism? United States is an individualist society, and many people say there is also a greedy corporate culture in the United States. So is there any relationship between the two? Obviously, why we have high spending is because organizations are greedy, so they charge a lot of money on individuals. Do you see any relationship between the two?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And so that's always the chicken or the egg question. Is it that we spend a lot of money because everything's so expensive? So for example, Medicare does not negotiate drug prices as opposed to in Canada where they are. And we all know that drug prices are lower in Canada. So you might expect that they would spend less money. I will say this is World Bank data, and it's adjusted for, I'll say, a lot of things that accounts for, at least I'll suggest, Kadir, some of what your concern is. So we could make these side-by-side comparisons. So things like inflation rates, year over year, currency exchange rates, they're all, shall we say, leveled to a standardized dollar. And I didn't mention that. This is World Bank data for the life expectancy. There's plenty of places to get life expectancy, but I thought I'll use one source for those two important pieces of data: per capita spending and World Bank. The measures of culture, those 6 dimensions, that data comes from Hofstede's research center in the Netherlands. And those numbers really don't change overnight. I mean, they if and when they change, it's more at a glacier pace. I wish I had a bigger sample size for my regression fans. We could argue whether I'm violating the number of independent variables. I would love to have had like at least 100, or depending on which book you read, if you have 100 data points, you can have as many independent variables as you want. Another rule of thumb is 15 subjects. So ideally, I would be 90 at least at 90 to 100. It does beg the question: could I go back and just focus on the dimensions that we've identified? And by the way, Hofstede has a lot of other measures of other countries, but they were incomplete. So, for example, he might have a measure of collective versus individual for Taiwan, but he doesn't have all the other measures. But that's the next project. This paper I presented at an international meeting this spring, and it's now in review. So there's a lot more here than I could express in 15 minutes. This is about 2 years of work.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so probably if really maybe we only have time for another question, or we have to move to the next one. But I also have the same question. Is that because at the beginning I expect that the result will be totally opposite, because Japan is a country is famous for like collectivism, but have a very long life expectancy. But your results suggest it's the otherwise. Yeah, that's what go back to your points. Probably we need to expand and look for more data points and see how those are related. I even found a reason for that, because say collective society, usually they have social support group, and then now many research suggests that it is very important. Then when you have a social support group, you tend to kind of social more, and then you live longer, like Italian Mediterranean lifestyle. But I think a very interesting topic. So
yeah, sorry.
would you?
Can I?
Yeah.
Well, I was gonna actually say the similar thing. I really enjoyed your presentation, Dr. Matus. First of all, I really appreciate your time and presenting your great study. But it's very interesting to see at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that Americans' life expectancy is a little bit lower compared to other OECD countries, right? But based on the cultural dimensions, life expectancy is positively correlated with individualism, which is higher in America, because we all know that, you know. So I think we need to have real answer why it's really happening. I think in order to justify the usage of the data, maybe we need to identify some of the ways to explain the trend here. That is my first comments that I have.
Yeah.
But it was really good.
Yeah, thanks. And Hofstede is very pointed and specific about what he calls and others call the ecological fallacy. This is a measure at the country level. So you're comparing country to country. So it would be, I'll say, inappropriate to say, well, Dean Freer is greedy because he's looking out for himself. It's at the country level, not at the individual level. Thank you.
Thank you. So sorry, Anna, we probably don't have time for your questions, so
No
we
problem.
have to move to the next one.
She can email him directly, I believe.
Yes, sure.
Sounds good.